Well, we've been doing quite a push for mini splits this year. We start having an increase of awareness of the capabilities of mini splits, and it's really developing its own niche in the market. And as that grows, the thing that we struggle with the most is proper training on mini split installations. And it really comes down to, as much of anything, wiring and flaring. That's the two things that are going to be a little bit different than what we encounter in the unitary installations. So when we talk about flaring processes, there's really two types of flaring tools in the industry. There's our traditional manual flaring block, which has been around for, I don't even know when the original one. I was trying to do some research to see how long we've been using a manual flaring block, and I can see it back into the early 1900s. So a traditional manual flaring block has been around for a long time. We're starting to see a lot of changes to that. But the thing that I always ask technicians in particularly is, do you still use a traditional flaring block or not? So let me launch a quick poll here just to get an idea of how many people use a traditional flaring block over a more modern clutch style flaring tool. I'll give it just a minute or so, because what I see in the industry is quite a mix, and it kind of depends on what you have experienced as you've developed into the industry. So polls say 67% say they do not, 33% say that they do. So that's really where it comes into play, is understanding the differences in flaring tools. So I grew up with a traditional flaring tool, but it wasn't until I started doing training and started understanding the benefits of a modern style clutch flaring tool that I realized how I've been doing things not so well over time. So one of the things that we typically experience in the industry, especially if we're working with manual flaring blocks, is when we have leaking connections, it tends to be one of two things. It tends to be a split or a crack in our flare, or it tends to be a flare that just wasn't completely flared to begin with. And if we think about the tools that we have used in the past, there's not a qualifiable standard for making a flare with a manual flaring block, a traditional flaring block. The rule of thumb was about a nickel thickness beyond the actual block should be enough to create the proper flare size. But that was about it. We didn't have anything to gauge it with. We just used a general rule of thumb, and I was taught to use a nickel. And as for the torque that we would put onto that armature, well, it depends on how strong your hands are, right? You know, my father-in-law, wonderful guy, great big hands, and he would torque flares to the point where it was hard to get them off sometimes. So we did a lot of commercial refrigeration. So we worked with flares quite often. So if you think about the consistency of flares, it really came down to either how well you were trained or how many times you had done it to where you were finally getting to the point that you're making a quality flare that was torqued down to enough torque to make the thing seal up. No standards though, nothing to say this is how you would actually do that. Now there are some rules of thumb on the amount of torque. So depending on the line size, whether it was quarter, 3/8, half, 5, whatever, you would have, approximately. So the rule of thumb was hand tight plus a quarter of a turn. And that was a general rule of thumb. But you would ask 10 different people how to properly make a flare and to properly torque the nut, and you would have 10 different answers. So torque on those nuts wasn't as critical when we were working with low pressure products. Because if you think about where this technology came from, the original copper and steel lines that we were flaring in the HVAC industry actually came from oil furnaces, right? That was the first time we started using copper to be able to run fuel lines or to be able to make connections in a HVAC equipment. Later, we moved into refrigeration where we're doing flaring, but originally it was from fuel oil. So the tools that we needed didn't really, they weren't required to make a fitting that operated under high pressure. We're only talking a few PSI. Those oil pumps aren't producing a lot of pressure. So the flare wasn't critical under high pressure. And as we started moving into like R12 refrigerants, it was still fairly low pressure. As we are moving into higher pressure refrigerants, now we have to start thinking about the integrity of that flare a whole lot more. So we've started developing techniques and tools so that we can get consistent flares. And I'll be honest with you, I was pretty good at doing flares because I did them for a very long time. But how could I judge the consistency of them? Not very well. So if we think about what we're doing with a flare, morning, Jimmy. What we're doing is we're taking a drawn piece of copper. Well, it's typically going to be some type of a soft copper. And we're trying to take that copper that starts out with nice, clean, perpendicular walls, and we're wanting to bow those walls out at a particular angle, and then we're going to be able to take two mechanical fittings and put that copper in between them and allow that copper to now become a seal between those two mechanical fittings. So for that to be a seal, that means I'm going to have a little bit of compression on that surface. And that's where we start understanding the difference between using the traditional mechanical block and the modern clutch style, is because that amount of torque that I use when I'm making that flare is going to determine whether that lip is actually going to be able to be compressed into a seal or not. Because if you use a high amount of torque on that traditional flare block, we're going to compress that copper to where it's no longer malleable, to where it's very rigid and is not truly a seal. It's just another form of hard material between our two very hard pieces of material, typically steel or brass, right, for our fittings, both for our flare and for our male fitting. And it can be different because I've been into residential application or commercial applications where it's been steel on both sides. So I'd have a steel service valve and I would have a steel flare nut. And then I'm using the copper in between those to make my bond, because we talked about dissimilar metals quite often, especially with electrical, where we have different amounts of heat loads on those dissimilar metals and they will expand and contract at different rates. Same thing when we're talking about our mechanical fittings. So we have metals that are expanding and contracting at different rates. So getting a proper seal between those two fittings is now becoming a whole lot more critical. So in our classes, we've been doing a lot of training on using the clutch style flaring tools, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So my brand of choice is the CPS, the Black Max stuff. Everyone makes one. Yellow Jacket, JB, they all have some type of a clutch style flaring tool, which I'm going to show you here in a minute why it is so much different than a mechanical block. And we're also going to talk about spring controlled tubing cutters. And even though that would look like a traditional tubing cutter, it's actually not exactly the tubing cutter that you're used to using, and I'll show you why here in just a second. And we're going to use a gauge to be able to make sure that we get consistent flares, to make sure that we're getting the correct diameter so that we have enough of our surface to be able to compress and to make a seal. So let's talk about this one real quick. So on a traditional tubing cutter, we simply have a solid armature between our handle and our pushing rod, which is going to put the pressure on our copper. But you'll notice on some of these modern tools, we've actually got a spring inside of that. And that spring is going to put constant tension onto that cutting tool. So with these, instead of not knowing exactly how much pressure to put on that tubing before we start cutting, now we have an exact amount of pressure that we can put on that thing, so that we're not putting an excessive cutting ring into that copper. So if you're working with soft copper, you'll just move it until we put a certain amount of tension onto the spring. And if we're working with hard copper, it's going to take more tension, so we put a little bit more torque on it, and it gets it to that spot where it says hard. The nice thing about it, though, is once we get to that point, well, I actually don't have a piece of copper with me right now. Once we get to that point, we put the pressure onto that soft, say we're working with soft copper, and we run that spring down until we get to the soft marking. That's all that we will ever have to turn that handle. because now it has sufficient pushing force so that as we are spinning around our copper line, it is continuing to put the same amount of force onto that cutter. And what happens is we end up putting a nice clean cut on our copper without putting a significant indentation into it. So we're not going to impede the flow of refrigerant through the ID of that copper. So simply moving to a tubing cutter that has the resistance to it will change how you begin your process. Because if I put too much pressure on it, I'm sure we've all seen whoever's used a standard tubing cutter and accidentally put too much pressure on it, or had a piece of copper that was out of round a little bit, you can put a heck of an indent into that copper, which is now going to degrade the thickness of the wall, so that even when we go to flare it, we're not flaring with the full thickness of the copper. We're trying to make a flare out of a piece of copper that already has an indentation down into it. So it's important to use a tool that is going to put the least amount of damage to the copper so that we can move on to the next process. So just the tubing cutter alone will make us rethink about how we're putting flares onto soft copper. And then we all know about reaming, so we want to use a good reaming tool. In that little kit, it comes with the little ProMax reaming tool. And nice thing about these is they actually have a spot in the end of the handle for extra reaming bits. So whatever you use, I've used pocket knives, I've used screwdrivers, I've used needle nose pliers, none of which were probably appropriate. The cool thing about using a good reaming tool is that we can just now clean off just the edge, just the part that did indent into the center, because we're going to get indentation into the inside of the tubing. So we're now going to try to get that ID back to its original size, but we also want to leave enough thickness of our copper so that we have an appropriate flare, right? So make sure you got a good reaming tool for doing that, because if we do it properly, that's what you end up with. You end up with a piece of copper that looks like the original piece of copper that we started with. So all we did is we put a minimum amount of pressure on our cutting wheel so that we put a nice clean cut on our copper, didn't indentate the copper too far, and then we just used our deburring tool to clean off the edge. So that is the piece of copper that I just cut with that tubing cutter. And as you can see, now we have a nice thick rim that we'll be able to make our flare with. Always remember to put your flare nut on too. Boy, I did that one time. So I was doing a refrigeration install, and boy, I was diligent. I was making a nice clean flare, and I got all put together. Looked over, and my father-in-law was just staring at me with that smirk on his face, and because he was watching me put this together without my flare nut. So yeah, only once. That one I definitely remember. I guarantee I probably did more of them, but that one, boy, that was rough, because when I looked over and I seen that I was getting watched while I did this entire probably 7 or 8 minute process, yeah, it made me rethink not to do that again. So yeah, there was probably more of them out there. So, and then we talk about that thickness, all right? So then we move on to using our actual flare block. So on a traditional flaring block, we have no gauge to know how much copper we're actually putting through there, right? Remember, the old rule of thumb was about a nickel. So a nickel is about how far we brought that through that flaring block. Well, on our modern flaring blocks, we actually have a gauge that we can slide over that allows us to know exactly how far to bring that copper through. So we bring the copper through until it touches the gauge, and then we clamp it down. And we also now have a rest so that we have a firm clamping of the copper, and then we can slide our gauge over, and then we can proceed to make our flare. But now we have a gauge to know how thick. So we used a tool that had a gauge for the amount of pressure to put onto the cutting wheel. Now we have moved on to a flare block that has a gauge so that we get the exact thickness of copper in our flare. And then when we look at that, it's a nice clean set, right? So when we move our flaring chuck up over the block to the proper place, we even have indicators so that we know exactly where to line up our chuck, because our chuck is actually going to be perfectly centered into the middle of that hole. And if you remember, those of you that have used a traditional flaring block, there's no such thing. Hopefully you get it center. And remember, on those traditional ones, that conical, that flare is centered, and it does not rotate at all. It sits perfectly centered. So if I don't get that perfectly centered on my copper, I have the chance of actually wobbling over to the edge. And I've done that before and had a flare that's kind of cockeyed. So we're actually going to use dimples that are in the side of our flaring block, and then there's a small pin that actually rests on that. And then when we are there, we're going to be able to run that down into the dimple, and it's going to lock us into place. So it's going to be a very, very firm, centered position to be able to start our flare. And we're actually on our flaring cone, it's actually designed to be off-centered so that it's actually wobbling a little bit, but it's under a predetermined amount of space. So it's got a small wobble so that it's cleanly starting to move that flare. Instead of pushing the entire piece of copper down at once to make a flare, we're actually slowly going to start ream it out from the outside. And so I don't know if we can actually see it, but that is actually going to rotate a little bit. You can see it wobble inside of there, so that we're getting just a nice smooth formation all the way around, so that we can keep it centered, but yet we can put a nice clean edge on it. The next important thing about these style tools is it has a clutch with a predetermined amount of torque, so that when we get down to the final rungs of making our flare, there's no guessing on how much pressure to put on that. There's not that difference between, someone who doesn't have a lot of hand strength in turning it and someone who has massive hand strength and over cranking it. Because if you over crank that, you're going to compress that copper lip so far that it's going to now be hardened and tempered, and it doesn't have any malleability to it. It's not going to compress to make a seal. It's just another hard surface in between two other hard surfaces, which means to make that thing seal up, it's going to take a lot of torque to get that to properly seal. So we need to make sure that we're getting that nice consistent lip. So we have a clutch that will do that for us, and it gives an exact amount of torque every time, so that the thickness of our flare is going to be exact every time. So when we get to the end of our torquing, it is actually going to skip back out of its clutch assembly. So if you look at that, let me grab my Sharpie real quick. If you look at that little stub right there will pop out of its chamber when it gets to the exact amount of torque. So you cannot over torque them. When you get to the amount of torque that chuck is set to, that's all. It will just continue to spin. It will not push it any further. And it's very easy to feel. When you get to that point, you'll actually hear it click. And you can see I'm starting to rise up out right now. As soon as I get to that point, it will actually skip out. There's there. And there it is. And once it skips, it's free. It can't put any more torque. No matter how much I spin it, it is not going to put any additional torque. So that now guarantees that I have a predetermined flare thickness. So now I have the proper amount of meat to put a seal in between my metals. That's the difference of using these style of tools. It gives us a consistent, predetermined amount of flare, so that when we torque this thing down to spec, there's no guessing. We've completely taken the guesswork out. So that's what it looks like when it's in its recess, and then it pops out as we get a certain amount of torque. And then it's just a matter of loosening up the tension on our chuck, and voila, we have a fairly perfect flare. Now, if I'm looking at this one, I probably wouldn't have passed this in one of my classes because I'm very particular about it. Because if you'll notice, my copper actually had right here just a little bit of copper that wasn't 100% consistent. But if I look at some of those that I would have used with a standard traditional flare block, I wouldn't have even had a lip out there. It would have been compressed pretty well flat. And that is where we get the splitting of our copper flare. if we don't have that consistent. Because if we have any place along that rim that is not consistent, when we go to torque that nut down, that is going to be the place that fails. And over time, when we have vibration and we have expansion and contraction of those dissimilar metals, that will also be the place that fails. So it just gives us the opportunity to create a pretty consistent flare. And once we have created that flare, now we need to be able to check the thing. So in that toolkit, we're also going to use a gauge. And that gauge, this is the one that comes with the CPS set. If you notice on that picture, if you notice in the very center of it, there's a very, very fine lip. Well, that lip is the goal of making our flare. That little bitty lip is what the manufacturers say, if you can make your flare consistent enough to rest on that lip, you're going to have a proper seal. So if you use a spring-loaded cutting wheel, if you use a clutch style flaring block, and you gauge it across an OEM specification, you are going to have an OEM specified flare. And you'd be surprised how easy it is to duplicate that with this modern style flaring block. So in our classes, I'll actually have both out. I'll have a traditional manual flaring block, and then I'll have a modern clutch style flaring block, and I'll just put out a bunch of pieces of copper and a gauge and go, okay, let's see how many flares you can get correct on the flare gauge with your manual flaring block. And oh, by the way, bring yours in from your van so you have the one that you're used to using, or you can use mine, whichever. And then let's move over to using the modern flare. And it's very surprising. So typically with a manual flaring block, only about 30 to 40% of the time people can actually get them to rest properly on the gauge. And with a modern style, it's above 90. So very significant difference in the quality of flares that we can produce using the modern style flaring block. So if you are working on mini splits, installing mini splits, multi splits, commercial refrigeration, industrial VRV, anytime that we're using flares, that's going to be your ally. Because from the technical support side, I will tell you, all of our calls for mini splits and multi splits are either wiring or improper flares. I can't tell you how many site visits I've went on poor performing mini splits just to find that we have leaking flares. Because if you've had the opportunity to work on a mini split, we don't typically have a expansion valve on the indoor unit. The metering device, which is typically an electronic expansion valve, is at the outdoor unit, which means we cannot read superheat and subcooling like we can on a unitary. I can't tell what my refrigerant charge is in a mini split. So I would have to remove all of the refrigerant and weigh it to see if I was actually low on charge. So creating that proper flare is going to make the difference on the product itself, because there's a lot of equipment in the field that gets a bad reputation because of a bad installation. So we're just here to help you understand that the tools that we have used in the past are not appropriate for what we're doing today. They were not rated for the high pressures that we use in these R410A refrigerants. So start looking at, if you want to come to a class sometime, if you're in our areas or you have a shop, you have a wholesaler in your area that stocks clutch style flaring blocks, every one of them should, take a look at one. Try it for yourself. And I think you'll see real quick, it will be worth your investment, because whether you're an installer or you are a service person, using a modern style clutch style flaring block and using the proper tools, you will produce quality flares that don't leak. So it's that simple. So when we look at the installation manuals, they're pretty specific on the type of tool to use and how thick to make that shoulder, how far to deburr it. And we're also going to start talking about how much torque to put on that nut, because that's the other thing, right? Traditionally, if I was making a flare, I had me 2 adjustable wrenches. And how much torque did I put on that nut when I put it together? Good question, huh? Sometimes hand tight plus a quarter of a turn. If it was a 7/8 flare nut, it might be hand tight plus maybe almost a full turn, but there was no way to measure that. There's no consistency. There wasn't a scale or a gauge to tell you this is how far. So when we move into these modern pieces of flared equipment, it's very specific. If we look at these numbers, if I'm working on a 1/4 inch line, it's between 10 and 12 foot-pounds. If I'm working on a 3/8, it's between 24 and 29. 1/2 inch, 36 and 44. 5/8, 45 and 55. So how much torque is that? Have you ever really thought about it? Because in the past, I thought I used about the same amount of torque for every flare nut, and that would have been incorrect. So now we need to have a way to check that, right? We need to make sure that we're using the proper tools for doing this. So taking that into consideration, I got a question for everyone. Just thinking about torque and how much pressure to put on something. How much torque is used to install a spark plug? So hopefully some of you have had the opportunity to change spark plugs in a vehicle or in a lawnmower or chainsaw or something, and maybe you haven't. That's okay. It's a good time to guess. But for those of you who have changed spark plugs before, have you ever thought about how much torque is actually specified for changing that spark plug? Well, let's take a real quick poll and find out. Is it 3 foot-pounds of torque, 13 foot-pounds of torque, 23 foot-pounds of torque, or maybe 33 foot-pounds of torque? Maybe you don't even know. I wasn't 100% sure until I actually put this class together and started looking at it. And it's very interesting to see when we start talking about that, because I was trying to find something that most of us would hopefully be familiar with. Of, how much pressure do I put on that adjustable wrench when I'm putting that spark plug in? So poll says 50% of the people say 3 foot-pounds, 50% say 13 foot-pounds. And it is actually about 13 foot-pounds. So the amount on that's an aluminum cylinder head on typically like a 12mm spark plug, which is what a lot of automotive spark plugs are, 12 to 14. So if we think about that, that's not a lot of pressure, right? When I'm putting that spark plug in, that is not a lot of pressure. That's the amount of pressure that we would need on a 1/4 inch liquid line on a mini split installation. Man, that is not very much. I could probably do that with 2 fingers, right? That's not a lot of pressure. So using the proper tools to set the torque on these things is the difference. Because in the past, I would use how much torque? Enough. That is how much torque that I use to close and seal up a flare. Enough torque, however much it took to seal that up. Not realizing that once I got past the torque that was needed, which on a 1/4 inch line is only around 13 foot-pounds of torque, everything past that, all I was doing was degrading the quality of my flare. I was removing the malleability of it, and I was decreasing the thickness right where that angle is. Where I go from a flat piece of pipe to an angled piece of pipe, I was now putting pressure in that joint, and I was squeezing down that copper for every extra foot or inch-pound that I was putting onto that fitting. So very important to know that we don't use the same torque on these different fittings. We need to use a torque wrench. And those torque wrenches, those proper flaring blocks, they're all available at your local Johnstone supply. We carry a variety of them. We carry the Daikin toolkit, which has actually been the CPS tools up until recently, and they recently switched over to JB. We also carry the Yellow Jacket, and these are designed for mini split, multi-split refrigeration installations and should come with everything that you need for that installation. The one thing that I have found in some of the kits is that they do not come with that separate flare gauge. So make sure that you have a flare gauge. If it doesn't come with the kit, you can order all of that separate. So those tool bags can be a little bit of pricey sometimes. So for those of you technicians that are required to purchase your own hand tools, you can buy any of that stuff individually. So if you already have some torque wrenches, or you're just going to go buy you a torque wrench from another tool supply, that's fine. You already got your own gauges. Make sure that you're getting a quality flare tool, a quality flare gauge, and a quality tubing cutter. Because the torque wrench, there's all sorts of different torque wrenches out there, but there's not a lot of the proper flaring tool, gauge, and cutters. And you can buy any of those individually. If you buy one of these kits, it comes with all this stuff. So some of that stuff is not needed. You may already have it. So when it comes to flaring, it's very important to know where we came from, to know where we are right now, and to be able to look at the tools that we're using and understand that the tools that we are using may be outdated. And that small investment in some more modern tools that are designed for these installations will change the way your installations perform. Because nobody wants a callback. That's lost revenue. So that one call, that one lost revenue from a leaking flare probably paid for these tools. So something to think about. All right, does anyone have any kind of questions, comments, thoughts on proper flaring techniques? It's a good class. I love doing this one. It's great to do it hands-on and be able to feel the difference in those flares and feel the difference in the torque. I always take the biggest guy in the class and I go, okay, here's 2 adjustable wrenches. Put this flare together, and I have them crank it down, and then I'll take my torque wrench and I'll start adjusting it until I find how much torque they put on it. You'd be surprised how many people will put 70 or 80 pounds of torque on a 3/8 flare. That's a lot, 3 times as much. All right, well, if there's no questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up for the day. I really appreciate everyone joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again on FlexTrain. Everybody have a great day.